Afrocentricity Bookman show here with you again. Don't forget, every Sunday between 4 and 6 p.m. BST. So without further ado, we are still reading the book called Our Story, edited by Ansel Wong and Ayaba Sebo. So we are on the 7th chapter now, and this chapter is by the great sister called Wanjiru Kihora. So we're going to be speaking about black women's contribution to history and just giving examples from Kenya. So this is the Afrocentricity Bookman show, and we're going to continue. So I wish to thank the organizers of Black History Month for visiting me or inviting me to speak on the black women's contribution to history. Unfortunately, since the invitation arrived very late, my preparation for this lecture has been done in a great rush. I have tried to do the best I can in this short time, so I ask you to bear with me. The topic, black women's contribution to history, is a very vast, especially since black people are to be found in all the continents of the world. What I propose to do, therefore, is to focus on Kenya, in the hope that this will provide a small example of contributions that black women have made to our history. I shall dwell at length on the important aspect of our history, that part which marked our existence as black people, and that is our history of resistance. What has shaped us as black people in our history of resistance? We have been a people in resistance against foreign intruders, slave traders, slave masters, exploiters, oppressors, and oppression of all forms. By examining our history of struggle, we are better able to understand the forces that have shaped our present. We are able to understand how we have survived as a people. By taking correct lessons from the history, we become better able to wage our struggles today in the different parts of the world where black people are exploited and oppressed. I recall our arrival in this country several years ago, when we received the welcoming treatment of being detained at the airport for a whole day, despite having fully paid returned air tickets as well as money for our upkeep, and despite the provision that as visitors from a Commonwealth country, we did not require visas for our entry into Britain. This was the first time our eldest daughter, then only 3 years old, encountered British racism. Several months later, after having settled somewhat in Britain, she experienced racist abuse at school, which caused her a lot of pain and anguish. She became terrified of school and would not venture near. For more than 1 week, we tried every method to reassure her, but to no avail. Our efforts included telling her stories about black people and black women in particular. We told her of the women like Ya Asantewaa of Ghana, Bumboya Nahanda, a woman leader of Zimbabwe's people's armed resistance against British rule. We told her of the women like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Queen Mother Moore, Angela Davis, and Winnie Mandela. We told her of our own Kenyan heroines like Mi Katihila, who led a 3-year war of resistance against British rule between 1912 and 1914. Muthoni Nyanjuru, the workers' leader, killed during the 1922 strike. Field Marshal Motathoni, a leader of the Mau Mau, and many others. We also told her of our black heroes, people like Kimathi von Wakuria, who in the 1950s led the Kenyan people in their struggle against British rule. People like Malcolm X, George Jackson, Nelson Mandela, Steve Biko, Walter Rodney, and Marcus Garvey, and so on. Although at the time she may have been too young to fully understand the stories, They seemed to reassure her and fill her with courage and confidence. We managed to persuade her to return to school, and after 1 week or so, we inquired as to whether the racist abuse had continued. She said it had, and that she was still being called Blackie, poo-poo face, and monkey face, but she added confidently, "But I don't care. When they call me all those silly names, I just shrug my shoulders and tell them, so what? There are many black people like me, good black people. I am black, I am beautiful, and I am proud." My purpose in telling you of this incident in detail is to illustrate the importance of having a positive identity as black people. It is to show the importance of knowing about our proud women and our proud heritage, about our glorious past and the lives of men and women who made that past. It is very important for us and for our children to know that they come from a long line of great men and women, that we are part of the great and heroic people whose history is the history of civilization itself. Yes, greetings, Nero. So during the research for this topic, I came across names of black women liberally scattered here and there. I have mentioned some of those names already. Others like Queen Alazinga of Angola, Queen Amina of Nigeria, the Amazons of Benin, and others. What singles these women out is their great courage, vision, and dignity. These women all played a very important role in our people's resistance to all forms of exploitation and oppression. All these women, leaders, arose out of our people's struggles and exhibited exemplary leadership qualities. Were all able to unite the people against a common enemy. But the task of documenting black women's contributions is hampered by the dearth of detail on women's role in general and leaders in particular. Living as we do in a patriarchal, male-dominated societies, women's role is often not given the importance it deserves. However, due to our oral tradition, certain names of great women leaders have been recorded. Some have been immortalized in songs, poetry, folk stories, and other art forms. So despite the lack of writers, or lack of written material, excuse me, just need a drink there. Despite the lack of written material, there is evidence that some of the histories of our black heroines have been handed down orally. Let me now turn to Kenya and quickly outline our history of resistance and the role that women played in it. In looking at Kenya, I shall focus on that part of our history which closely connects us with the present. That part of our history which starts with the imposition of British colonial rule. This is not to accord any less importance to our earlier history, but in my view, this immediate past has been very important, bearing on the state of affairs of the present, neo-colonial Kenya. Okay, Queen Mother Moore. Okay, so one sister, Kinero, say that she met Queen Mother Moore. So I was lucky to meet her once myself as well, when she was 13. So that was a powerful, powerful meeting there. So the imposition of British rule, and with its integration of Kenya into the international capitalist system, brought about a significant change in our society. The establishment of a British settler economy depended on the acquisition of Kenyan land and forced African labor, land alienation, and the introduction of private ownership of land speeded up the pace of capitalist development, transforming the feudal pre-capitalist mode of production into a dependent capitalist one. Of course, our economic structure was distorted to produce raw materials for overseas British consumption. The British came into our country at the end of the 19th century, first as a company, the Imperial British East African Company, and later the Foreign Office sought to consolidate and its influence beyond a handful of forts spread throughout the country. In various parts of the country, Kenya resisted this imposition of alien rule and of our history to replete it with examples of many battles waged against the British. This resistance continued right up to the independence in 1963, and women as a part of the society were involved in all of them and emerged as leaders. The struggle revolved around the question of land ownership. The British, using the same excuse as in South Africa, alienated African Kenyan land under the pretext that it was unoccupied. It's amazing, Europeans always said they came to Africa and there was nobody there. Maybe they went on holiday. This resistance continued right up to the independence. The British, using the same excuse as in South Africa, under the pretext that the land was unoccupied and therefore was theirs for the taking. The peasants were the first and the most directly affected. As land became scarce, peasant women were forced to seek work on settler farms and as domestic labourers in European homes. In the early years of imposition of British rule, our people's resistance was localised, and there were no strong national organisations mobilising and leading the people in struggle. Individuals, especially religious leaders, emerged as powerful forces against foreign intruders. Here we find many women playing leadership roles in spirit mediums, relying on their past experiences and on our oral history, which recorded the previous invasions by foreign intruders. These women were able to forecast the effects of British settlement. They played an important role in mobilising people against the intruders. They commanded great respect among people and were able to communicate with the people in a language that they could understand. Some of the most important struggles was one led by Makatilili, a 72-year-old woman who led a war against the British that lasted for 3 years. Let me spell that for you. MC, and then Katilili, Katilili, Makalili, 72-year-old woman who led a 3-year battle against colonialism, against the British. She mobilized the Girama people, the Gariama people, in their resistance to land alienation and foreign domination. The British authorities arrested and deported her to Kasai, several hundred miles away from her homeland. She and her male assistant, Wanje Wa Madori, managed a daring escape and trekked back several hundred miles with support of Kenyans along the route to Giarama. But Makatilili was not an extraordinary person as such. She was carrying on the tradition of resistance inherited from her mother, Giarama. But Makatilili was not into resistance, and she inherited the tradition. Extraordinary person as such, and she was carrying on the tradition of resistance inherited from her mother. The seer, Makpo Ho, she had foretold of the coming of the Europeans and had warned that when they landed in Gariama land, that they would end the Gariama traditions. I will quickly mention some of the other women leaders of the early struggles. Sakoi Mao, who played a very important role of the Kamba people struggle against forced labour and land alienation around 1911. Using songs and dance, she mobilized the people and urged them to boycott forced labor. Women like C.O. Tuna was one of the earliest political detainees of the British. She organized a canber against forced labor, land alienation, and the cruel treatment of the colonists. In 1912, she was detained by the British and deported to an island near Mombasa. So Mombasa, that's off the East African coast, sometimes called the Swahili states. Other women leaders of this period were Moray Ngeti, Chebu Wanjila, who mobilized the Marakwet against intruders. Bonnier Riri, who led a movement of opposition of colonial rule in Kisai in the 1920s. Moving from that early stage of localized resistance, we come to the time of our history when our people began to organize themselves into political organizations. This is an important development. In the period from around 1919, a number of African organizations emerged, and once again women were involved in some emerged as leaders. One of the most important struggles of this period was the workers' strike, organized when Harry Thuko, the workers' leader, was arrested. A spontaneous strike, the first in Kenya's history, was organized. A large number of women became workers, and they too took part in the strike and demonstrated calling for the release of Harry Thuko. A British writer of the period, remarking on the courage of the women, said, "There were fully 200 women who were collected outside the prison. The women made a great noise. Very slowly they made their way towards the corrugated fence. They came to within a yard of the bayonets." So women fighting again resistance from African women there. 1912 we're talking about, and 1921. Mary Mathona urged the workers to march into the police station and release their detained leader. When the soldiers opened fire, she was the first to die. Other struggles of the period evolved around the issue of female circumcision. While not being an advocate of the practice myself, I am totally opposed to the imposition of other people's culture on ours. I hope you all heard that. She said that she doesn't personally agree with the female mutilation or genital mutilation or circumcision. However, she said, "I am totally opposed to the imposition of other people's culture on ours." In the conflict between the Christian missionaries and Africans, a number of independent churches and schools emerged, and women once again were active in the movement. So that's a very interesting point there. It says, in the conflict between the Christian missions and Africans. So why would there be a conflict? Aren't the Christians supposed to be missionaries, supposed to be there about love and brothership and friendship? So why there is a conflict? You can see that we must understand that these Christian bodies are just tools and the arms of the colonial system. The church in Africa has never been for Africans. The church in Africa has always been as part of one of the tools of the domination of these foreigners, of these settlers and colonists. We must always keep that in mind. Some people think that the churches came to Africa and done something good, but they were just tools, weapons of the domination of the colonialists. We must always keep that inside. Otherwise, there won't be any conflict. Let me continue. Women who had taken an oath were at times more steadfast than the men. One of the let me go back a moment. Okay. In the struggle for independence led by Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, otherwise known as the Mau Mau, women were again at the forefront. Women like Field Marshal Muthoni are remembered for their leadership, along with leaders like Kimathi and Mathenge. Women participated in the armed struggle of liberation as couriers, intelligence gatherers, organizers and informers, recruiters and food, ammunition supplies, and as fighters. They suffered just as much as the men did and were tortured just like the men to obtain confessions. So that's the British torturing African women. They always like to talk about British values. What are the British values when they're torturing women? Shooting women. Women who had taken their oaths were at times more steadfast than the men, like the Mau Mau writers, Gakara, Wanjao. In his book, Mau Mau Writer, Detained, speaks of how some women would refuse to speak to their husbands who had confessed. Kakara says that the Mau Mau women taught him, and when women committed themselves to something, they held on it steadfastly. So that was the women there telling the men that you need to fight harder. And when they confessed, but you just remember though, it's hard for them not to confess because they're being tortured. So you can understand when some people did confess. But anyway, the women weren't happy when some of the men confessed. Large numbers of women were detained for their involvement in the freedom struggle. In one camp alone, there was more than 200 women. These included women like Rebecca Njeri, Sarah Sarai, Makumi, Kamathi, Mathula Mahenge, Naimakaki, Kakondo, Priscilla Wambaki, Wanju Kagoro, and many others. Apart from detainees, there were women who tried and were tried and jailed for their activities, mainly fighters who had been sentenced to death. The punishment meted out to these guerrilla fighters involved the burying of convicted Mau Mau prisoners. In one last act of defiance, they used to bury their executed comrades with full military honor, facing Mount Kenya. And Facing Mount Kenya is a very famous autobiography, you know. In one last act of defiance, they used to bury their executed comrades in full military honor, facing Mount Kenya. So despite the brutal beatings by jail guards who tried to prevent them from performing this last act of honor for their fallen comrades, they persisted defiantly, and the jailers were forced to concede defeat. Mention must be made of the important contribution of Kenyan women of Asian origin. These women played an important part during a period when workers' struggles were at their height. These women were involved in the legal and democratic struggles, in the trade union movement, and also in the struggle for independence. They provided shelter and refuge for the Mau Mau guerrillas and helped in the distribution of underground literature. Women like Leela Anumbai Patel, Emma Pinto, whose husband was murdered soon after independence, Basant Kaur, who was one of the leaders of the first workers' strike, and Fatima Kudabuks, the first woman in the Legislative Council. So this is Brother Jagna, this is the Afrocentricity Bookman Show. We are reading the book called Our Story, and we are reading the chapter about women freedom fighters in African history. We could mention many more other names of women, ordinarily working class and peasant women, who were involved in our people's resistance to British rule. But the above examples will suffice to show that Kenyan women played an important part in our history. Their participation led to a qualitative transformation of the lives of women themselves, as it gave them confidence and was a crucial factor in the advancement of their political consciousness. Their involvement in the struggle against foreign domination shows how women, the most oppressed sector of our society, fighting against the burden of illiteracy, fighting against negative attitude towards women, and are capable of challenging the forces that exploit and oppress them. Peasant working class women's involvement in the resistance to foreign domination clearly shows that the potential women have to resist all domination and all forms of repression and exploitation. It also provides a key for women seeking to change their subordinate position. This change can only come about when women become actively involved in the struggle to change their own condition as oppressed women and the conditions within the society imposed by outside influences. This presentation would not be complete without a quick look at women's role since independence in 1963. Greetings, Gebra. Greetings, Gebra. So we go there in 1963. It is important to bear in mind that the independence negotiated at the Lancaster House in 1960 and 1962 was not the true independence that generations of Kenyans have sacrificed their lives for. That negotiated independence was meant to install a neo-colonial regime in Kenya, a replacement of white British rulers with black people who would rule in their interests. Before conceding independence, the British had elaborately worked out a system whereby a class of Africans had been recruited to take over from them. What this has meant is that our economy continues to be dominated by foreigners. Our people continue to work and be exploited under this foreign domination. Once again, women, and especially the peasants and working class women, have been at the bottom and have borne the brunt of the neo-colonial policies. Once again, these women have resisted strongly in workers' strikes, peasant boycotts of government-backed cooperative unions, and other forms of organized and unorganized resistance. Kenyan women have been at the forefront of the resistance to the presence of US military bases in Kenya. The Moi regime secretly granted to US military bases in 1980. Soon after, Monica Njeri and Lucy Kabura were murdered by US Marines and their killers set free. The Moi and Reagan regimes insist the bases are facilities for rest and recreation. What this means is that the regime has prostituted Kenya's women to serve the needs and interests of US Marines. Prostitution and drug trafficking has increased as a result of the presence of US military. People who speak out in protest are jailed, detained, tortured, killed, or exiled. The Mombasa woman, Halima Assa, was arrested for protesting against the presence of the US military and the bombing of Libya. My husband, Wanyuri Kihoro, has been in detention without trial in Kenya since 1986. It is a significant coincidence that he and the many other Kenyan detainees are jailed since January 1986 have, on the way to another, expressed their opposition to the presence of the US and other foreign military bases in Kenya. So we can see the US has military bases all over Africa. And she's speaking about the 1980s and during the Obama regime of USA. They were still getting, I think in Kenya, Ghana is one, they're still getting US air bases in Africa. Why have USA got military bases in Africa? Has African nations got military bases in the USA? And as she said, when you got military bases there, what you notice is that prostitution, because the men, want to have relations, drugs. So it brings a lewd, a destructive economy to the nation where there wasn't one there. When Europeans came to Africa, there was no prostitution trade, stuff like that, no drug trade going on. But unfortunately, when Europeans come there, this is what happens to Africa. And then it continues like it's a normal state of affairs. But African leaders need to be stronger. So that Arab Moi, he granted secretly US bases in Kenya. Why would you have foreign armed troops in your land? Okay. Anyway, I continue. In looking at the current repression in Kenya, one finds women are playing an important role in the resistance. As a result of the massive arrests and jailings and detentions, women are left to take care of the families. In some cases, wives of political prisoners have themselves been arrested. Kenyan women have been found creative ways of expressing solidarity with one another. In January 1984, for example, the wives of political prisoners held a vigil that was attended by more than 100 people. The struggle of Kenyan women has to be seen as part of the struggles of African people. These in turn have to be seen within the context of our heritage as black people and of oppressed people. The struggles of Kenya women follows in the tradition of their long heritage of resistance, stretching back to struggles waged by black and third world people against foreign intruders. The struggles that cover the days of slavery when women resisted slave raiders, a time of slave riots and rebellions in the Caribbean and the Americas. It is a history with a long tradition, and many women's names appear. Women like Nia, leader of the 18th century, who led the Maroons in their first revolt, and the only woman in the history of the USA to have led troops into battle. My apologies. A leader of the 18th century who led the Maroons in their first revolt. Women like Harriet Tubman, the first campaigner against slavery, and the only woman in the history of the USA to lead troops into battle. It is a history that covers many years of struggles in the Caribbean and the Americas. There are women like Amy Ashwood Garvey, who was the co-founder of the UNIA. I would like to propose a number of things in the task of rescuing and reconstructing our history. The most important one is that women have been seen, or have to be seen, as part and parcel of black people's history, and because they have been hitherto ignored, because of their contribution has not been adequately documented, we suggest that great efforts be made to research and document black women's role in history. So I hope you're all listening out there. We are not asking that they be accorded any special favours. On the contrary, all we're asking is that their contribution to be highlighted. And by doing so, we shall be sure that the lives of great black women leaders will serve as examples to us and our children. Their lives will become something for us to refer to positively, and will guide us in examples or in attempts to reconstruct our own history and redefine ourselves as a people. I say that? Apply. Greetings. Yes, greetings, Daniel. For our rescued and reconstructed history to be correct, a correct account of events reflecting the aspirations of the majority of our people, it must be based on a correct analysis of the forces that have shaped our people, a correct analysis on the links that bind us, the forces that oppress us, and the ways in which we have been resisted, the ways in which we have resisted. This history must be based on a correct class analysis. Not all of us were the same side throughout the resistance, and we are not all affected in the same way by the intruders and by their systems that we have lived under. For example, those whose material have been based on the exploitation of subject people, kings and queens, did not suffer the same exploitation and oppression as peasants and workers. Consequently, the resistance to foreign domination differed. Those of us who were forced labor on colonial land, and had no land of our own, experienced a different type of degree of exploitation from those peasants who own their land. So it is very important that our history be based around correct class analysis. It must take into account the contradictions that have existed and exist in our society. between imperialism and nationalist aspirations. This history must have as its main thrust the restoration of the working class and the peasant women to their rightful role. We must also correctly analyze our own history in order to learn correct lessons from it, which is very important, because if we do not learn the lessons of history, we will continue to make the same mistakes. We must remember that among our people, some stood on the side of the enemy and betrayed our people's aspirations. We must take a correct lesson of tactics and strategies and organizational forms, which in turn will help us to guide our current strategies. Our reconstructed history must be rescued from the museums and footnotes of European tales and adventures of plunder. It must be dynamic in order to help us to move forward. Our reconstructed history must be capable of adapting itself to non-written forms of communication. Most of our history is oral and has been transmitted through songs, dances, and through our culture. So in rescuing it, we should pay particular attention to this. Our history must not just fill up textbooks. It must be a living history of our people's struggle with nature to provide from our material well-being. Above all, it must be a history that reinforces the positives in it. And for us, it portrays a positive image of black people as dignified men and women, fully capable of shaping our future and our destiny. So, one moment. So that was the end. That was the. So I hope you enjoyed that. That was about African women. Let me get to the front here again. Our talk was supposed to be about African women, but because she said she had a short period of time, she focused on the women of Kenya in particular, even though she did mention the USA and the Caribbean women as well. And at the end there, it's very important, she says that we must rewrite and reconstruct history, particularly putting women in there, because their focus is, we focus like our oppressors, and we focus on men all the time, and normally kings and queens as opposed to just the regular people. So this is Wanjiru Kihora, Black Women's Contribution to History, Examples from Kenya. So it's very important that we reconstruct our history. I mean, every 20 years, there's always a rewrite of the history with new information. And equally, we should use that time when we rewrite history to have done our research, so we write a correct history. So she said, so our children and our ones coming behind us can understand and learn from this. And she started the book with saying that her daughter had a really hard time at school. When she came to school, she was being called all kind of racial types of names. But after reading to her daughter many of the histories of some of our great queens and leaders and fighters, she had much more confidence. So she said when she went back to school and they were still kind of abusing her, she said, so what? She said, I'm not going to let those silly names bother me. And it kind of empowered her too, yeah? So, and I was having a conversation with Nero before that. A lot of time, our children have some sort of mental problems at school. But the children who have more awareness of their history and culture have less problems than those ones who are not aware as well. So understanding history, culture, understanding Afrocentricity helps to kind of keep us psychologically stronger. So knowledge of self is not just knowing about kings and queens and dates. It kind of empowers us, gives us a confidence and a strength as we move forward. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move on. Let me say this is the Afrocentricity Bookman Show. We are reading a book called Our Story, which is a collection of lectures which was done in the UK in about 1987. Nero, yes, each one teach one. I'll give you 100% there, Nero. So what we're going to do, we are going to continue with a new chapter. So let me get there now. So we just read a chapter by Wanjiru speaking about African women, African women's contribution to history. So what we're going to speak about now is Dr. Maulana Karenga. So Dr. Maulana Karenga, as you know, he founded the Kwanzaa celebration in 1966. And the first chapter of his book was by Karenga. So let me get to page 177. The title of his book is called The Political Economy of Oppression. And this was delivered on the 2nd of October, 1987 in the West Indian Centre in Haringey, which I'm sure many of you know very well. So let me get there. Okay, so this chapter is called The Political Economy of Oppression by Dr. Maulana Karenga. I would like to start by giving you the traditional African or Swahili greeting of Habari Gani, which means what's news, and which the answer is Njima, or good news. It is a culturally and politically positive greeting because there is good news in that regardless of the current conditions, history is on our side and we will win our struggle for liberation and a higher level of human life. So again, so the greeting is Habari Gani, which means what's happening, what's news, what's going on. And he says the correct reply is Njima, which means good news. I greet you in the name of my organization, US, which currently celebrated its 22nd year. We are an organization of the 60s, and there are not many black organizations left from the 1960s. In the 60s, there were many, but now not so, just a few. So we see a vacuum, but we have stood the test of time. We have not only withstood the suppression of the national and local police, but we have also withstood the slander of our enemies who try to undermine what we are doing by calling other names or calling us other than our name. And by that, I mean history, and the work has vindicated us. We place our achievements and endurance besides any other party and let the masses decide. The masses will decide who really is doing what, who has dared and sustained a protracted struggle against the established order, and who has changed or given out, or given in, or given up. So I greet you in the spirit of Pan-Africanism and our common struggle for liberation as African people and a higher level of human life. The struggle for liberation that we wage is an important work, for it will affect us not only as a people, but it will affect the history of the world. That is why Fanon, that's Frantz Fanon, who was insistent in his last chapter in The Wretched of the Earth, in urging us to sit down and decide to do something new, to decide not to be the obscure caricatures of Europe, not to walk in the pale shadow of our oppressors, but to dare to think something new and raise above the earth images that reflect our historical charge, that we set in motion a new history of humankind. For in spite of all that is said, we cannot leave that to Europe. Because Europe, who had a chance to unite the world and to cultivate a new kind of brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity, since it went all over the world, instead of uniting the world, it's oppressed and colonized the world. Thus, it can no longer claim either the right or the ability to offer a moral and credible paradigm for human society or human relations. Those who savage humanity cannot save it or instruct it. I hope you all listen here. Europeans went across the world and they had a chance to unite humanity. But what did they do? They decided to oppress and suppress and dominate humanity. So they do not have the moral right to tell the world what they should be or should not be doing. So when they went around the world and had a chance to do that themselves, they decided to steal, torture, mutilate the world. So, let me continue. And I've lost my pace now, so bear with me. The struggle then is a struggle of African people in the third world and progressive people to pose a new paradigm of human life, to begin a serious and protracted struggle for liberation of a higher level of human life. I want you to know that what I am going to say, I say intentionally. When I say liberation and higher level of human life, I want you to understand what I want to emphasize here. Our struggle is to defeat, not simplify our enemy, but also to pose a whole new way of humans to relate to each other. And that is why it is important for us to discuss the three major contradictions that prevent the new world and the new man and new woman from coming into being. Those three major contradictions are racism, capitalism, and sexism. These are the three structural and value systems of the world that we struggle against in our daily life and also in our efforts to free ourselves from the grotesque grasp of our oppressor. And when I say these are contradictions, I don't want to mystify what I am talking about. Contradiction is essentially a conflict problem or a conflictual problem that demands solutions. But if you look to the structure of the American society or the British society or the French society or any society that Europeans control, as Fanon says, its deformed descendant, America, is the same thing in terms of the structural tendencies that limit human liberation and human personality and its capacity to fully relate to itself. In such a limiting context, it's important for us to think great. For us, as Fanon reminds us, we are a world historical people. Fanon urged us not to lock ourselves down in preoccupations simply for ourselves. He thought rightly so, that we had something to offer the world, to build unity and harnessing our material and human resources in order to speak to that special truth. So when we are called upon today, African people, let us step outside of ourselves so that we can more clearly see ourselves and communicate and contribute with others. Third world and progressive peoples to the transformation of the world. In fact, our oppression and struggle are so key that the world will never be free until we are free. And we can never free ourselves by the same logic, without creating through struggle the momentum and basis of freedom for the whole world. We are at the bottom of the hierarchy of oppression. And when you are at the bottom, any rising that you do shakes up the whole set. In a word, blacks are so positioned in human history, so positioned in society, that when they rise and free themselves, they, of necessity, free the very society in which they are. And in order to do that, they have to deal with three major contradictions: racism, capitalism, and sexism. But the real problem with this is that this is not simply the system of oppression. This is also the absorbed racist values without apologies or understanding of what it means to history and humanity. Some of us have absorbed capitalist values, and with or without capital, we are locked into it. Some of us are sexist and resist admission to it. That is why it is an imperative for us to remember Cabral's contention that the greatest battle, regardless of the obstacles that the oppressor put in our way, is the battle against ourselves. Shall I repeat that? Cabral's contention that the greatest battle, regardless of the obstacle that the oppressor put in our way, is the battle against ourselves, against that which is in us, which is a contradiction to our higher values and the choice for liberation that we have made. Thus, we struggle not simply against the oppressor, but against what he has made us through living in a society of oppression. Again, the three major contradictions in society of the world today are racism, capitalism, and sexism. These are sometimes called the race problem, the class question, and the gender problem. Now, racism and capitalism, as a fundamental negatives of society, affect even our personal relationships with each other. Therefore, if a revolution is real at all, it has to improve the human relations. Revolution is not simply taking over the state. It's above all establishing a new basis for new human society and new human relations. All revolutions must be judged by how they improve their relations with each other and give us the basis for self-realization in community. Thus, we cannot talk politics without talking about the most fundamental of relationships, the relationships of men and women. Often, this is so difficult to discuss because we refuse to be sufficiently self-critical about how we relate to and the tendency to give more weight to our struggle against the oppressor. But when we talk about struggle, especially amongst ourselves, we must talk about the quality of our relationships or the lack of quality of our relationships. Here, a brief description of each contradiction is in order. Capitalism is a socio-economic system that turns anything into a commodity, a thing that can sell and purchase, and relationships do not escape this. Racism produces the practices and which engender self-hate, self-doubt, pathological fixations of the white model. Sexism is a social practice of using gender to explain, establish, and maintain relationships. And it teaches and leads us to impose a support unequal, oppressive, and exploitative relationships based on gender. Given these contradictions and their effect on us, the problem is how can we struggle against both post-society and that which society has made us. Let us start with racism. In order to struggle against the problem, we have to, in fact, define it correctly. Most people, even though they say racism really means racial prejudice, but racism and racial prejudice are two different things. Race prejudice means dislike for someone based on biological features and some assumptions that they have about those biological features. This includes not liking a person because they have yellow hair, blue eyes, or not liking a person because they have a dark hair and dark eyes, or because they have weak features or bold features. We're not exempt from that because we live in a racist society. Created by Europeans, we introduced race as a definitive category of human identity and worth. This is its contribution to our understanding of these things. It doesn't mean that other people didn't have cultural chauvinism, which made them feel their culture was better than others. All people seem to have had this. But racism differs in that the white man lined up people and measured their noses, their lips, and assigned their human worth and social status based on their lips and assigned their human and on this. So what we are talking about here is not simply racial prejudice. It's about a system of denial and deformation of a people's history, humanity, and right to freedom based on exclusivity, or primarily on the specious concept of race. Thus, the key differences between racism and racial prejudice is the ability and fact of imposition. Racial prejudice is an attitude of hatred, but racism is the ability and will to impose the attitude of hatred as public policy. That is why blacks can be racially prejudiced, but they cannot be racist. For regardless of what they feel, they don't have the power to impose it. Racism, then, is a system of denial on defamation of a people's history, humanity, on racial terms. History and humanity are dialectically linked, and thus European attempted to deny us our history so he could deny us our humanity. For he could prove that we had no history, he could in fact prove that we had no humanity. And that is why he claimed all relevant history for himself. And this is why he moved Egypt from northeastern Africa to southern Europe or Western Asia. For to claim all of the relevant history was to claim all relevant humanity. Hope you listen to that one there. Greetings in Nero. So very true. This is a message from Nero. Very true. The distinctive have been deliberately blurred, or the distinction have been deliberately blurred to keep the masses in a state of confusion, fighting about superficial differences. Excellent point there. So what the point he just made is very important. He said that Europeans took all history themselves. They took our great civilization from the ancient world, Kemet, ancient Egypt, and moved either into southern Europe or Western Asia. But by doing this, and by claiming it for themselves, they took away our humanity and claimed their own humanity. So history is about our humanity there. If we don't have no history, effectively we've got no humanity, because we didn't do anything in history. We didn't do anything. No, our contribution to the world has been negligent or non-existent. So by denying a people their history, you're denying a people their humanity. Let me continue. This is the Afrocentricity Bookman show. Don't forget, every 4 till 6 p.m. in this group and on blessradio.co.uk, we do the Afrocentric Bookman show, where we read the best books from an African point of view. Moreover, racism is a system based on the specious concept of race, a concept all of us use. We must, however, make a distinction between how we use race and the way European uses it. When we say race, we mean peoplehood. But when European says it, it means a hierarchy of humanity, with him at the top. When Garvey says, "Up, you mighty race," he's talking about a peoplehood. He's talking about all of us as African people. He's talking about a culture, a history, a land. But when the white man says race, he means a hierarchy of human worth and social status. Hope you're listening here. For the real meaning of race, for the European, stripped of all its cultural costumes and pseudo-scientific mystification, is that it is a socio-biological category used to assign human worth and social status, using the white man as the paradigm, the model, the paradigm, or exemplary model. In such a context, the white man is the model, and based on how you look, how much you look like him, and that is what your human worth is, and that is what our social status is. Rescue me if I'm wrong. Look at human society, and you'll see black people, Indians, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and others developing self-doubt and self-denial and affected with this pathology sickness, yeah? Full of sickness, imposed by Western values, European culture, wanting to look like the white man. But no matter how much material wealth they possess, they still cut their noses and cheeks. Example, Michael Jackson, for example, yeah? They still attack their hair and bleach their skin. They do this not because they like white as white, for white is not really It's not in real life always a positive color. In fact, it could and often does represent sickness and death, or the need for a tan or beauty enhancement. So the self-hating person is not identifying with white as white, but with a history that gives him or her unchallenged humanity. I hope you all heard that one as well. So when we want to bleach our skin and frizzle our hair and cut our noses and lips and stuff like that, we're not doing it because we actually want to be white, but we're doing it is because when we grab that white, we are grabbing a humanity, a history, and a culture. So it's a symbolism of what that whiteness kind of means. Is that another message? So, and again from Nero, and in doing so, they assigned our many contributions to the world as being subjective, storytelling by us. So what they look like is a limp-haired dog. No, sir. And no for none of it. No for none of it at all. I agree with that, yeah. But they pose it on the mind. If we go along with their game, we'll believe it's normal. So let me continue. So moreover, the European system is based on the specious concept of race, a concept we all use. We must, however, make the distinction between how they use it. So let me come back here. They do this not because they like white, for white is not real life always a positive color. In fact, it could often and does represent sickness, death, or the need for a tan or beauty enhancement. So the self-hating person is not identifying with white as white, but with history that gives him or her an unchallenged humanity. And even the possession of wealth is no protection against his sense of deprived humanity. For racism follows black millionaires, just like it does follows black poor people. Remember, LeBron James is probably worth $500 million, but he bought a new house in LA. People still do racism across the house with paint. So he's half a billionaire, but he's still not run away from racism. This is why we just must unite and don't care. When we unite, we don't care what people say about us. But when we're individuals and fragmented, this when they have a power over us. When we have unity, it's all over. It's all over. Let me continue. And then the possession of wealth is no protection from this deprived humanity. For racism follows black millionaires like it does follow black poor people. And it makes them hate themselves and to strive to get into that history and share in that humanity denied to Africans and other third world people through racism as thought and practice. Even a black millionaire does not have the same social status as a white millionaire. A poor white can spit on a black millionaire and be exonerated, and the media will invite us to mourn over the death of one white oppressor and dismiss the death of 1,000 third world people killed unjustly in the struggle for liberation and higher levels of human life. And our thoughts and practice is race, and it is used to diminish human rights and social status. This is one of the most destructive things that the European has done against humanity, i.e. divided people by their nose shape, their lip size, and then assign to them human worth and social status based on that. We must, in all seriousness, begin to correct this. But it will be difficult because once they imposed it on us, we begin using those terms. In fact, one thing that angers me so much about the European is how he compels me to spend so much time discussing his negatives. He will not change and admit his crimes against humanity, and thus must be studied and confronted. He has rewritten our history. He denies that we even have a history. He has appropriated our classical civilization, Egypt, pretending it is his. He provides the negative to human relationships by its behavior, and thus we must struggle to avoid becoming like the oppressors we oppose. Now, when I said racism as a system of denial and defamation of a people's history and humanity and their rights to freedom, it is important to understand that racism has three fundamental aspects. First, it is a historical imposition. Secondly, it is an ideological justification. And thirdly, it is an institutional arrangement. So when I say historical imposition, I mean the first act of the racist is to impose his will on others in racial terms. In other words, he came into our lives, appropriated our history, and made us a footnote in his own history. This is the definitive act of racism, i.e. to appropriate our history and our labor in the process of his conquering us and wrecking and ruining our lives. The great injustice that the white man did against us was simply destroy our cultural creations, because we can remake them, not simply forcing us not to talk about our language, because we could still talk secretly. It was not his appropriation of our labor, for with this appropriation of our labor, he took from us the central human activity by which people create themselves, or creates itself, identifies and develops itself to confirm itself. I am confirmed by what I do. I teach, and that is my identity, teacher, and it is my means of confirming my worth. If I am a writer, then I write, and that identifies me. And also, okay, let me get there. And if a people cannot control his own labor, it has a diminished understanding of its history, because we're known and know ourselves by the images we raise above the earth that reflect our identity and capacity for human greatness and progress. So let me read that again. It is this appropriation of our labor for which the activity, for this appropriation or this activity by which people create itself. So obviously we create ourselves by what we do, by what we create, what we raise above the ground. That's how people identify themselves and develop themselves and confirm themselves. I'm confirmed by what I do. I teach, so that is my identity, a teacher. It is my means of confirming my worth. If I am a writer, then I write, and that identifies me. And it also confirms me in my creativity. As if with a person, so is with people. If a people cannot control its own labor, it has a diminished understanding of its history, because we're known and know ourselves by the images we raise above the earth that reflect our identity and capability for human greatness and progress. We don't know the ancient Egyptians because we met them. We know them because they left a great cultural legacy, great monuments of humanity. This is part of our African heritage, but we don't have these monuments of our greatness to our mind. For even though we as Africans made them, we don't identify with them. For the Europeans violated and damaged our historical memory. We are forced to refer to him. In psychology, we must refer to Freud, Jung, Adler, not to Francis Cress-Welsing, Naim Akbar, Wade Nobles, Joe Baldwin, Emmons Wilson, and Bobby Wright. So let me talk on that for a moment. Our frame of reference has been warped, because our frame of reference is like the book we have in our head. So when we want to know something, we go to that reference and we say, oh, yeah, that's where I am. Or that's what I'm looking for. That's where we start. But when our frame of reference has been removed, our frame of reference becomes a reference of the Europeans. And that's what empowers him. So rather than looking at Francis Cress-Welsing and Amos Wilson, we start to look for Jung and Freud, things like that. So it's very important that we reinstate our own frame of reference. We are the fathers and mothers of human civilization, and we introduce the basic disciplines of human knowledge in the Nile Valley. But this is denied, and Europe becomes the place to focus. Thus, racism imposes its history, compels us to know European history rather than our own. We have our own classical literature, as they do, the oldest sacred text in the world. The Book of Ptah Hotep, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, the oldest social justice text, the Book of Kunanup. But historical amnesia developed and imposed in the enslavement process denies us this knowledge. The imposition is so tight that you feel bad not knowing your history, but the history becomes a measure of your humanity, even though you have a history yourself. Thus, we see the structural character of racism, which imposes a daily structured pattern to our lives. Even when you want to think positive thoughts, you can't because you don't have the categories for it. Rescue me if I'm wrong. How would you describe African beauty in the face of you white standards of beauty? He says fair is beautiful and confuses us with his face. Did you know that when you say fair, that means pretty and white? And no matter whether the white man is ugly, even by his own mother's standards, when you say the white man is ugly, you say white, that alone is supposed to mean something. Thus, the self-hating of self-doubting black or other third world man in seeking beautiful women by white standards seeks the white woman, any white woman, even if she's ugly. And this is not simply a fascination with the color, but because of the humanity and history that the color claims to represent. So sometimes you see people with the most ugliest looking person you could find, but because of their whiteness, they think they've got it made, and maybe they're getting some of their humanity. They feel good, they empower them. So this is a psychological damage what's been done to us. The imposition is so tight. Secondly, racism is not only an imposition, it's an ideology. This ideology means a pseudo-scientific, pseudo-intellectual contentions about third world people. I mean people of color. If I refer to chronology, Africans are the first world people, and even racist anthropologists admit this. But when I say third world, it means third block. This evolves from the concept that there are three major power blocks of our time. The first major world power in our time was the capitalist world. It was challenged by the communist world in 1917. Then there were those countries, that bloc or that world, that accepted neither capitalism nor communism as a third way. Thus, the third world is also defined by three things: economic conditions, color, and revolutionary practice, to eliminate the artificial condition imposed on them by the oppressors. The second aspect of racism is ideology. And that is a justification for the imposition. When the white man leaves us out of history, he has to justify why he's doing it. And he justifies it by saying, we haven't done anything. And when he says he brought us God, he justifies that by saying anything. He justifies that by that we prayed with sticks and stones before he came. And this is in spite of the fact that he has cross sticks around his necks in the church, on which he turns to prayer. And it is said to prove our primitiveness. Even though he eats bread and drinks wine in the symbolic gesture of eating man's flesh and drinking his blood. This is mentioned not to belittle Christianity, but to suggest a more humble, a more modest claim and exchange by the European. For not only has he claimed religious and racial superiority, he has also appropriated the identity of God. And it has in a great part worked. For many people feel I am criticizing God when I criticize the white man's appropriating his identity. But the white man is not Jesus or God. In fact, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad has argued that given his historical behavior, he is the opposite of God. Still, when many Christians think of Jesus or God, the image that stands up in their mind is a white man, who is Michelangelo's cousin as a model, not God or Jesus. And it is a testimony to the strength of the deception and cultural hegemony that the people react to my criticism of this arrogant appropriation of God's identity, as if I was criticizing God himself. But again, the white man is not God. And if he is, why is he oppressing us? And struggling against our legitimate aspirations for liberation and the highest levels of life. Excuse me 1 minute. Not only has the European deemed our history and humanity, or denied our history and humanity, it has developed an elaborate system of pseudo-scientific contentions to justify it. Not only has he claimed that we are subhuman, he's denied our humanity. Not only has he claimed that we are subhuman, we have small brains and large genitals, but even claims God sent him to us. If that were so, we would need to question God himself for sending us a conqueror to teach us freedom we already had, an oppressor to teach us justice we already knew, a God we already worshipped. We would have to be historically ignorant or somewhat self-hating to believe we are the first people, and for thousands of years God never spoke to us, and when he did it through desert dwellers and later slave holders, who imposed on us the greatest Holocaust in human history, the loss of 50 to 100 million persons in the African continent, the fact that we already had sacred texts older than all others, and Jews and Gentile and Greek and Persian came to Egypt to learn. For Egypt was the light of the world. Our need is to rescue and reconnect or reconstruct that history, because in that history is evidence of our humanity and our material to impose a needed racial modesty on Europe. And if we don't rescue and reconstruct our history, we will always appear indebted to the world rather than the world be indebted to us. Greetings, Gebra. Yeah, you agree 100%. So very, very powerful words here. So this is the Afrocentricity Bookman show. We've got some very powerful words here coming from Malala Krenga, who let us think about things we don't normally think about there. For too long, or as he says here, rather than being debtors to the world, we'll show people that the world is indebted to us, as Sheikh Anta Diop has contended. For too long we have been on and in and under the religious cross conceived and constructed by Europe. It is imperative that we self-consciously change our lives and break through the ideological barrier that the European has put up to block our liberation and prohibit our even thinking positively about ourselves and our future. One of the most important aspects of our oppression is what I call ideological imprisonment or conceptual imprisonment, a condition in which the oppressor sets the I'll get to it in a minute, parameters, thank you very much. He set the parameters of our thoughts and deprives us of the very categories and knowledge we need to think freely. So put away, he's locked our minds in this box, a Western box, yeah, a European box. So we can't even think that term, think outside the box. We're locked inside this box of their values, their constructs, their philosophies, yeah. While we stay in that box, we'll always be imprisoned in that box. We must break free from that box. True, I never thought about that. Blatant cannibalism, okay. Yes, it's true, they'll call us cannibals, but when they do their rituals, they're drinking wine, possibly the blood of Jesus, they're breaking bread, possibly the flesh of Jesus. So it still symbolizes cannibalism, but impose onto other people that they're cannibalism. I remember when they said they went to the Americas, and they found these people in like Mexico and stuff like that. They said, oh, these people, human sacrifice. That's why we conquered them, because they were barbaric, they were human sacrifice. But what do you think lynching is? In the USA, they lynched Africans for centuries and burnt them. Human sacrifice. Is anybody into human sacrifice then? Certain people? Okay, let me continue. For a long time, we've been in and under the religious cross constructed by Europe. It is now imperative that we self-consciously change our lives, and break through this ideological barrier that Europeans have set up to block our liberation and prohibit our even thinking positively about ourselves and our future. One of the most important aspects of our oppression is what I call ideological imprisonment or conceptual imprisonment, a condition in which the oppressor sets the parameters of our thoughts and deprives us of the very categories and knowledge we need to think freely. If he refuses to teach our history in the public schools and universities, how do we challenge him? If both his logic and language, his data and reasoning dominates to the exclusion of all else, how do we discover truth, speak it, and begin to self-consciously live it? We must break the monopoly he has historically on our minds. Through work, study, and struggle, we must reject his daily celebration of himself and be unimpressed by the drive down streets named after our oppressor, unmoved by a drive by Buckingham Palace and all the statues and monuments, his mass murders and conquests mass murders and conquests around the world. We must teach a new history which reflects our moves beyond historical amnesia, a history of study, work and struggle for liberation and a higher level of human life. A third aspect of racism is institutional arrangements. After Europe has lied about its people's humanity, after it has conquered them and appropriated their labor so that they can't even recognize themselves in their role in the product of their own labor, then it builds structures to perpetuate and promote the imposition of an ideology of racism. Thus, in the institutional aspects of racism, and nowhere is this more clear than in the educational institutions that omit, distort, and deny our history. One of the most important things about African Jubilee Year is that it teaches our black presence in London and what black people did to achieve and achieved. Often when we say we want to know our history, but then we talk as if our history happened overseas in Africa. Great is our history in Africa, but great also is our history in the USA, in the Caribbean, South America, England, and other places where we find ourselves. There is no history like that of our mothers and fathers right here in England. And you must be able to see that. For often people mystify history and believe it is something other people do. Moreover, they pay homage to Nkrumah and Mugabe, but fail to understand the relevance of their own immediate struggle. This is not to minimize the historical greatness of any of the continental Africans, but to call for greater appreciation of the African people who walked and worked and fought down these streets so that we might meet here, know yourself better, and have a better life one day and experience real liberation. It is said that history is made by great men, but in fact it is made by the masses. They are the unsung heroes. There is Nkrumah. It's because the masses of Ghanaian people made him a hero and made him a leader. If there is a Sekou Touré, it is because the Guineans masses identified him as a leader, and then gave him the support so he could stand tall and shield us. His height comes from avoiding or standing on the shoulders of the masses, as he does at the height of his anonymous soldiers for national and human liberation. And we must recognize and honor them. Surely if we deprecate the masses, then we deny the value of the masses, then we will eventually deny our own value. And we will always end up walking in the tall or short shadows of somebody else. You must appreciate that you make history also, for history is a very human thing. We bring it into being by what we do and do not do. Thus we must understand that everything we do is important and a continuation of that history. Every night we don't read, every day we refuse to learn our own history contributes to a negative history. That's a very good point. There is a quote by King Keti found in Hosea, a sacred text of ancient Egypt, which says, every day is a donation to eternity, and even 1 hour is a contribution to the future. So we must understand that what we are doing or not doing becomes a part of history. When we failed on an exam, or when we fall in love with each other and work with each other, Europe and your enemies are recording that as the essentials of black history. However, when we do great things and they try to create it or deny it or distort it, and this is why we must write our own history. As the Honorable Marcus Garvey said, our history is too important for us to depend on outsiders to write it. Europeans can't write it because it is the history that holds them accountable for the crimes against humanity, and it is difficult for a people to condemn themselves. Our history is about condemnation in thought, speech, writing, and practice of our oppression by the Europeans, and they can't write that. I said institutional racism means that the oppressive puts in place structures and processes which perpetuate the ideology and the imposition. They build a court system that goes along with the ideology that blacks are criminals, and then they convict them in great numbers and put them on death row. They establish an educational system, leave out black studies to confirm that their claims that blacks have not done anything worth academic attention. Their intention is to assign us a derivative relevance rather than accept our original relevance. It is the process by which creates and sustains a slave. For a slave, by definition, is a derivative being whose relevance resides in his relationship with his master. Thus, they are given their master's names, John, Susan, Johnson, Jenkins, etc. like all other pieces of property. You understand? But you're free and self-determining people. You write your own history. These institutionalized arrangements in schools, in courts, wherever we go, are structured along the lies that the white man has tells about us, and which we must do. And what we must do is struggle against those institutional arrangements, struggle against that ideology, struggle against imposition, and pose a new paradigm of how human society and human relations ought to be established and pursued. If there is a racism, there must be a counter to it. Where there is oppression, there must be a revolutionary struggle to end it. And where there is a lie about our humanity, there must be a counterforce to redefine our own history and our own humanity and reshape it in our image and interest. This means nationalism and Pan-Africanism. Nationalism on the world level is Pan-Africanism. Nationalism is a local self-concept, and Pan-Africanism is an international self-concept of what it means to be an African. It is important then to define nationalism itself. So nationalism is a social strategy and struggle that seeks to do three fundamental things. First, nationalism seeks to redefine reality in our image and interest. That is to say, redefine reality to a more truthful and human image. The first act of a free people is to redefine reality in their own image and interest. Among the first acts of redefinition is drawing a distinction between what is actual and what is real. The white man tells us what we see now, that actual is real. The actual is only what is, but the real is a thing that ought to be when it reaches its full potential. The real is fulfilled potential. Therefore, the actuality of an egg is a reality of an egg as a chicken. And the egg will never be real until it fully realizes itself in chickenhood. So, it is with a score with an acorn. The acorn is not an acorn, it is a oak tree striving to come into being. The actuality of the seed is the acorn, but the reality of the seed is the oak tree-ness. Therefore, a Negro is not really a Negro. She is an African striving to come into being. And what we must do is to develop our people's human potential and help them break free from their social and mental bonds and redefine our world in a more human and African image in both thought and social practice, i.e. through study, work and struggle. The second aspect of nationalism is a social corrective. When I say nationalism is a social corrective, I mean hard-fought, hard-won struggles to correct the social injustices imposed on us by our people. In the final analysis, black people, we have to confront. We have to struggle. We can discuss as we must, but we must struggle based on conclusions of those discussions. I am one of those who draws a clear line of demarcation between talking and doing, discussion and action, thought and practice, for they are all both important and mutually refining and reinforcing. Discussion is important because it clarifies what you think and what you're going to do. And act without thinking is dangerous, but to think without acting is unproductive. At best, it is irresponsible. At its worst, We should not undermine conversations and then engage in it. If conversation is so bad, don't be a part of it. But don't make speeches. Don't do anything except go through life looking mum laughter. Let's be honest. We are against not speech, but abusive speech, uninformed speech, unintelligent speech. Excuse me. Sickening speech, and speech that we could do without. With a person, you could make any point you want to. Social correctives means organize, stop mourning, stop idle complaining, and get up and organize. If the oppressor took it from you, then you can take it back. That's the real question. And some people don't want to face it. Some turn to God and expect him to do it all. But the reality is, any real God who represents human autonomy is waiting for you to do something. Marcus Garvey said that after God made the world, he left it to us. Thus, it's all right to talk about God and say our prayers if we want, but in the final analysis, practice proves everything. That's what God is looking from us, a self-respecting, morally autonomous person. Thus, if you are to be an abused person, God wants you to end your abuse and end your oppression. This is the message from God, that you must fight everything to get. You must get every space in Africa. You must take and hold. And that history is hard. Well, that history is people. We've funded. Let me read that. Frederick Douglass said, without struggle, there must be struggle. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did and it never will. We are lying to ourselves if we expect liberation just to happen, and we don't want to do it or do what is required. And we are satisfied with saying mournfully that it won't happen. It is in my lifetime. Whatever does that mean? That you are going to you're going to die real soon. And so we must get it done. We must work and build as if we are going to live forever, and struggle and build as if we're going to die tomorrow. Then we will achieve great, enduring things. And thirdly, nationalism is a collective vocation, a common purpose, a common commitment. In the 60s in the United States, we had a clear purpose. We wanted to destroy the establishment, and establish order and respect and self-defense. We wanted to destroy segregation. We wanted black power, self-determination, self-respect and self-defense. We had a collective vocation. We changed the face of America through struggle, through our struggle. We posed a model for Africans on the continent and other places in the diaspora. We even posed a model for Asians and their struggle groups, because we dared to define our collective purpose and to organize and struggle around it. People need a collective purpose. Without a common purpose, the African people in England cannot give their best in anything. Until black people in England pose for themselves a collective vocation, they will not be able to organize and direct their energies to a common good. I say this not to violate your self-determination. I am simply sharing with you the lessons of history and struggle, which we have learned through work, study and struggle. A collective vocation is essential, even if there is a disagreement on how to achieve it. It is a source of focus and inspiration, and thus we all need a collective vocation. Not only do we need it in England, but we need it in the United States, because we've lost that vocation we had in the 60s, and we've got to rebuild it. Moreover, the continental Africans need a collective vocation on both nations and on the continent, people and culture. We must be a grand strategy that includes the liberation and unification of all of Africa. As Nkrumah taught us, for one people cannot truly be free without the other. And if they do become free without the other, it's vulnerable, contingent, and fragile freedom, because they're surrounded by people who are not supportive and who can penetrate and take back the gains that they achieved. Until all of us are free, all of us are in danger of unfreedom. So we need a collective vocation. Somewhere, sometime soon, we need to call the International People's Congress. We need to do more than the OAU. The OAU is a continental structure. We must do what Nkrumah said, reach beyond the continent to all African people and call all African People's Congress that deals with the international aspirations, visions, and struggles of black people. Well, Africa is not simply a continent, it is a world community. The second major world struggle is the struggle against capitalism. And against capitalism begins by understanding what capitalism is. Now, when I say capitalism, I am talking about imperialism. Because I define imperialism as capitalism on an international level. There are two major economic systems in the world, and they are at the same time two major socio-political systems, capitalism and socialism. The struggle between capitalism and socialism as models of what the world should be and look like affect and involve black people. And if we are to free ourselves and contribute to the liberation of humanity as a whole, we cannot deny the struggle between these two systems, and we are part of that struggle. It is a battle for the hearts and minds of people all over the world. And by these two main socio-economic systems of capitalism and socialism, the world nevertheless, socialism as an alternative to capitalism is oppression, and thus we cannot support it. On the other hand, communitarianism tradition, our philosophy of Quader, is like a burning bush, Marxist, but in the shared world, a tradition of communalism, which Nkrumah correctly observed is the social-political ancestor of socialism. In other words, we had socialism before Marx and Europe. We had a shared wealth concept. We had a collective ownership of the means of production. We had an egalitarian distribution of wealth. We had a central planning. So we didn't have to walk and pretend that somehow this gives us a new status. What is important is for us to ask, what is the value of the system that we are discussing? What is the value of socialist theory of Marxism? We don't just name ourselves after a man and feel somehow enriched. We ask ourselves, what can we draw from the pool of human knowledge that can enrich and expand our lives? And what you have here is a socialism practice as expression of communalism or communitarianism values or shared wealth. In the end of socio-economic political inequalities of capitalist society that we all need to be committed to and for which we all need to struggle. Now, Quader is a concept created by Maulana Karenga and his organization. So Quader is a cultural philosophy. Now, Quader recognizes critical Marxism as opposed to vulgar Marxism as being the most severe criticism of capitalist societies. Whatever you have learned about Marxism at its best, it is the most critical and most incisive theory of opposition of capitalism. It is the most incisive critique of capitalism. and make a distinction between vulgar Marxism, which does nothing but engage in what I call hagiography, raising and praising the names of the socialist saints and critical thinkers. Marxism, which seeks to actively correct some of the inadequacies of historical and beginning Marxism. Okay. For example, European Marxism is limited by the socio-historical context in which it evolved. It reflects its racial, class, gender, origin, and thus deficient in its discussion of race and racism. The masses, as distinct from the working class, and the problems of sexism, also requires more simply a reflective and a reflection of the economic base. There are problems that the most critical Marxists concede. What I would do, however, is not even discuss Marxism as a philosophy, but talk about socialism and the possibility of an African form of socialism. All right, so what I'm going to do here, I've got to wind up now. It's virtually 6 o'clock now. We're going to wind up here because this chapter is still going on. It's got quite a few pages still to go. So I'm on page 191. We had a long talk here, but the key thing here is that it says that we must study, we must have discussions, we must come to conclusions, and we must act on those conclusions. It is the only way. We must organize around it. We must have goals and set our goals and targets and move on. Okay, so people, have a great week now. It's just a few minutes to the hour of 6 o'clock. Have a great week. This is a long chapter here. We'll continue reading this chapter next week, okay? So have a great week. Stay safe, yeah? Our ancestors are looking out for us. So stay safe, and we'll speak again next week, yeah? So I'll agree with what Nero says, self-determination, self-reliance is paramount, and they are key to our ability to thrive and excel. Excellent, yeah. And I love that, thrive and excel, because some people say that I'm just kind of surviving. We are the original people on the planet. Surviving is not enough for us. We must thrive and we must excel. And only by having our minds right, discuss, come to conclusions, and then act, organize around those conclusions. Always remember the 3 I's: identity, interests, and intentions. Once you know your identity, you'll know what your interests are. And once you know what your interests are, that will shape your intentions. That will shape your thoughts, yeah? So guys, have a great week. We'll catch up again next week. We'll continue with this chapter here by Malana Karenga, yeah? So one love, everybody. I'll take you. See you next week.